Now, another way to approach preaching has been proposed by Rick Warren. Rick Warren, the pastor, just recently retired, but pastor at Saddleback Church in California. He is a fantastic communicator. He's very biblically centered and rooted. My only criticism, if I can say such, with Rick Warren is he doesn't stick to exposition of a primary passage of Scripture. He'll use a lot of Bible verses, and so we would lean to say that Rick Warren's approach to preaching is topical. Now, topical preaching is not horrible. In fact, it has many strengths. It's very practical, and it can tie together different themes and motifs in the biblical narrative. The risk with topical preaching is you can kind of put your own spin on things, and you can cherry pick verses and take them out of context. So that's the risk factor with topical preaching. But with Rick Warren, I call his approach applicational preaching. Applicational preaching. And here's what we mean by that. Every major point in his sermon is written as an application. So the theology is kind of embedded in the sermon, but the primary focus is put on, here's what you must do, here's how you respond, and put this into practice. So we call that applicational preaching. Every major point is stated as an application. He often will provide a sermon outline, a written sermon outline, or if you're online with your phone or your laptop, you'll get a sermon outline. Sometimes it's got the fill in the blank format, so it's meant to engage you as the listener more deeply, more personally, so you're actually grappling with the implications of the message. He does use multiple passages of Scripture, and many verses of Scripture can be used throughout this approach. So it's not your classic expository preaching methodology, but I want to bring it to your attention because Rick Warren does have a significant voice in the field of preaching. So he uses the idea of an applicational bridge, and I'll try to give you a little bit of a sketch of what this looks like. See, the biblical text, let's take the New Testament, let's take the book of 1 Corinthians. It's written in the first century. So Rick Warren uses the idea of then being first century, and contrast that with now being the 21st century. So he says we have to get from then to now. I agree. He is absolutely right. So he calls that the applicational bridge, moving from then to now. Another way to look at it is, he says, we have here the biblical text, and over here we have the needs of people in our church, in our congregation. So we got to get from the theology and the context of the biblical narrative to people who live in the 21st century and are sitting and listening to this message. Thirdly, he says we can frame it this way. We move from the Word to the world. From the Word to the world. We can't neglect the Word, obviously, but we've got to connect the Word to the world in which we live today. All preaching should do this. Then he says we have in the Bible past revelation, and now we have the current situation. So again, cross that applicational bridge. And then he says we're looking at what was to what is. So what was might refer to the culture and the context of the Roman Empire. But if you live in Toronto or Nairobi or Sydney, Australia, or Brazil, well, your context is different. So we got to move from what was to what is the reality of today. And then he says, move from interpretation. We got to do biblical hermeneutics. We got to do biblical interpretation. But then we got to move from there over to, so what? What are the implications of the interpretation? So again, very, very important to cross that bridge. Then he says, you know, we could, if we stay in the biblical text only, and we just sit there, we become commentators on the biblical text. He says that's not enough. We must be communicators. And communicators, of course, put the emphasis on how it speaks to me in my modern world and what are the demands and the calling of Scripture upon my life. So move from being a commentator on Scripture to a communicator of Scripture that results in life change. And then finally, if we only preach, you know, the biblical text, it's like we're living here in the first century, but we got to live, instead of living, let me say it this way, instead of living there in the first century, we got to live here in the 21st century. That's where we live. And so preaching must speak into where we live in our current culture and the challenges of culture and the collision, if you will, between the gospel and culture. So good preaching crosses that applicational bridge. And that's Rick Warren's contribution. I'm Fred, and this is Fred Talks. Thanks for watching.